Hi, this is Ron Cipcic. In this particular video, we're going to look at another monopoly myth, which is the idea that monopolies are always profitable. Monopolies can be profitable in the long run due to barriers to entry. If you study monopoly in depth, you'll read about the different barriers to entry that can allow a firm to earn profits, economic profits in the long run. For instance, some sort of government protection, maybe a certificate of convenience or a patent, or perhaps the firm enjoys economies of scale. In other words, it has gotten so large and has taken advantage of its largeness to drive its costs down to a position where new firms cannot enter and compete. Or perhaps the entry costs are very high that to get into the market it requires so much capital that competitors just can't get in. Or perhaps the firm is the sole owner of a key resource or a key technology that also could keep new firms from entering the market. So yes, a monopoly can earn an economic profit in the long run, but to assume that all monopolies are profitable, that's mythology. You can be the only producer of something that people don't want. You can invent something, patent it, and in the end find out that it doesn't fly in the marketplace. For instance, the picture that is shown here is a picture of a monopolist that has a relatively weak demand curve, and because it has a weak demand curve, it has a weak MR curve. And the way we know that demand is weak is that the demand curve is pushed way over to the left. So if the demand curve is pushed over to the left, the MR curve is pushed over to the left. So if there's not much taste for this product, then that demand curve and MR curve is going to be pushed way over to the left. And that, of course, would push this firm into a loss position. If you look here, you see that the demand curve has dropped below the ATC curve. Well, you can see that at any output rate we could choose, the price would have to be lower than the ATC curve. And if the demand curve is below the ATC curve, the firm cannot possibly be profitable. Now, if this condition continued for a firm into the long run, if this were a private firm owned by shareholders, for instance, this firm would go out of business because even if I have a monopoly position, if I'm not profitable, my owners have no reason to stay committed to this particular product. It's clear the marketplace is not voting for this. Remember, consumers are ultimately king in a market system, king or queen, however you want to look at it, in that even if you're the only producer of something, if consumers don't want it, it isn't going to fly. You're not going to stay in business. You have to cover all of your costs in the long run. So if your price isn't sufficient to cover all of your costs in the long run, you're going to have to go out of business. Now, sometimes government will step in and subsidize a monopoly that is losing money in the long run. For instance, we look at mass transit, bus systems, train systems, Amtrak. Amtrak's a great example of this. If you actually look at the Amtrak system, you see that the government has to subsidize it basically every year. Why? Because its average total cost is greater than its price. And so what ends up happening, if you're thinking of Amtrak, let's assume this is the picture for Amtrak, that perhaps the cost of a certain on a certain route, the cost of transporting a person is $70 a ride. This is quantity down here. This is quantity and this is dollars. And so let's say that we're looking at rides here, and it's $70 a ride. The average cost of transporting a passenger is, say, $70 a ride, but say the market will only bear $40 a ride. Well, Amtrak is losing $30 a ride. and let's say that this is 2 million rides along this route. Well, they're losing 2 million times 30 million. So if you actually costed this thing out and ran the profit numbers, price minus ATC times Q. And again, I'm giving Amtrak the benefit of the doubt here. I'm assuming it's optimizing. You say, what do you mean optimizing? It's operating where MC equals MR. In other words, this is optimal. This is optimal. What do you mean optimal? Losing money isn't optimal, but if this firm is going to stay open, it wants to lose as little money as possible. Where does the firm operate to lose as little money as possible? That's where MC equals MR. So this price is the optimal price, and this is the optimal quantity. But you can see here there's a problem, because at a price of 40, the average total cost is 70. So the operating loss per ride is $30 times 2 million rides. Well, that's going to be 60 million. That's going to be 60 million on that particular route. And of course, if this is going on, now I'm going to put that in brackets, because that's not a profit, that's a loss. This is a negative here. This is a negative $30 a ride. So if you take negative 30 times 2 million, you got a negative 60 million, and that could be on a particular route or a particular region of the country. So the government will step in sometimes in the interest of providing a service or a product that it feels necessary to the public interest, and that's clearly what's going on here. That this train system wouldn't exist unless the government subsidized it, but this is considered to be a public service, and it's provided in there's some public interest that this is supporting. Now, when you dig into this, it may be that you have certain legislators who benefit, their districts benefit from having Amtrak located, and so it creates jobs. Let's say on the eastern seaboard or along certain train routes, it creates jobs, and so these politicians have an incentive to see that Amtrak stays in business. It's like local bus systems. The Kalamazoo or Grand Rapids bus system, or bus systems in places like Chicago, the L in Chicago, the train system, the local train system in Chicago, these are losing systems. They lose millions and sometimes billions of dollars a year, and what keeps them in business? It's got to be government subsidies. So this loss, this is not a profit box. This is a total loss, and is actually the minimum. It's the minimum total loss, and this is going to have to be covered with some sort of operating subsidy for Amtrak or a local bus system, or this could be healthcare. This could be healthcare. You go, what do you mean? Well, the Affordable Care Act in many areas of the country, particularly at this date, the Affordable Care Act is not so affordable. Remember, the Affordable Care Act, or what is commonly called Obamacare, is a system for people that were previously uninsurable. So these are generally going to be people with pre-existing conditions, and people that weren't able to either get insurance through an employer or buy their own insurance because they had some pre-existing condition, and for them to buy that insurance would be too expensive. And so what the government has done is it's stepped in, and it's basically tried to create a market for insurance where people who participate, or insurance companies that participate, have to be willing to take on people with pre-existing conditions. Well, when you take on somebody, when somebody can sign up for insurance who already has cancer, the insurance company knows it's going to incur very, very high costs for that patient. So if you have to treat every person who comes to you with a pre-existing condition, your cost structure is going to be very high. On the other hand, young, healthy people in particular see no reason to buy this, and in fact the government has to penalize them for not buying insurance, but the penalty isn't very high, so many young people choose not to buy insurance, so the demand for this insurance can be very, very low. And so these what we're starting to find, and it, I'm not saying that this is going to be the permanent state of the Affordable Care Act, but right now there are many regions of the country where no private company wants to participate in these healthcare exchanges unless they're subsidized. In other words, unless the government is kicking in money to help pay for these people who are who are signing up with pre-existing conditions. So whether you're talking about healthcare or whether you're talking about mass transit, there are many cases where the government gets into the game because if the private sector were left to its own devices, if shareholders and owners had to provide this service, they wouldn't provide it because they're losing, even if they're optimizing, they're losing money. Now I'm giving just to kind of, I'll just wrap this up with this idea that we're giving these public providers of this service or this product the benefit of the doubt. We're assuming they're optimizing, but a very important question would be: do they have an incentive to optimize? I mean, if you're a government monopoly, what incentive do you have to be efficient? I mean, whether you know whether you're efficient or not, you get to stay in business because taxpayers subsidize you. So just for the sake of argument, say that you choose not to operate at the optimal quantity. You choose to produce more than the optimal quantity because, say, you're receiving political pressure to expand your service. Say you're not producing at QM, you're producing way out here at Q high. I'll just call this Q high. So your goal is to provide a lot of service, and the government's going to subsidize you. And so what's the effect of that? Let's just take a look. Suppose you operate at Q high with this cost structure and demand structure. You can see we've got a big problem here, because to sell that amount of the service, there's low demand for this. Again, low demand means the demand curve is way over to the left. So there's low demand. So to sell this volume of service, you got to charge a very low price. So here's P low, way down here, but your average total cost is way up here. Your average total cost is way up here. So I'll just call this at ATCL to correspond with P low. So yeah, by expanding your service, you've been able to maybe drive your average total cost down and spread those fixed costs out over more units. But to sell those units of service, you have to dramatically decrease your price. Well, you can see here we got a problem. We got a major problem. Our loss box is much larger. So this entire area here is now the loss. And this is not the optimal production rate for this firm. We are not operating where MC equals MR. In fact, we are producing lots and lots and lots of units where the cost of those units is greater than the benefit. So that's resulting in an enormous loss box here. And unless the government steps in and subsidizes this to a very large degree, this service would never operate, and it would never operate at this volume. Okay, so I'm just illustrating that. Let me just review the key concepts here. That, first of all, not all monopolies are profitable. And if a monopoly is not profitable and it's a private monopoly, in other words, it's privately owned, it's going to go out of business eventually, unless it can get into a profit position. So you can be the only producer of something and not be profitable. Some of these monopolies will be considered by the government to be in the public interest. So, for instance, Amtrak is a good example of this. And if Amtrak's efficient, It'll still lose money, but you know, if it's efficient, it'll try to lose as little as it can, but the government will still have to subsidize it. However, if Amtrak is not efficient, if it overproduces, tries to produce too much or too little, it'll be in a position where its operating loss is much larger, and it'll be in a position where taxpayers will be on the hook for much larger payments to keep the thing afloat. So really, the difference between ATC and P, this vertical distance, is the loss per ride or per unit, and that will have to be made up by taxpayers. And so in essence, taxpayers provide Amtrak riders with a subsidy, whether they are poor, and oftentimes I think the government wants to provide this kind of service because it believes that perhaps poor people are more likely to ride the train between, say, Chicago and Kalamazoo, or Kalamazoo and New York or whatever. That poor people are more likely to take the train than more well-to-do people. So in providing Amtrak, you're providing basically transportation for the poor, and that's the argument that can be made for bus systems and certain subway systems. But at the end of the day, the taxpayer is having to subsidize those rides. Okay, we'll wrap it up there, and there's of course other examples and much more to say about this, but that's sufficient.